My mother-in-law seems to think I'll stay quiet forever, but I stand up for myself. 0026 change everything in one bold move. A few feet behind her, her husband Jerry was sprawled on the living room couch, remote in hand, barely paying any attention to her or the two children who were playing in the adjacent room. "Dinner's almost ready," Mary called over her shoulder. Her voice was strained. She wanted to keep her tone light, as though everything it was as if nothing had happened, as though the last conversation she had overheard between Jerry and his mother Janet hadn't hurt her feelings. Jerry didn't respond, but he gave a slight grunt, acknowledging her words. His eyes stayed glued to the television screen. Mary swallowed the tight knot in her throat, trying to keep her Janet was due to arrive that day, and Mary could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. It was always the same with Janet. She'd come in and criticize everything about Mary, from her cooking to her appearance, her care for the children and, worst of all, the way she took care of them. Mary never seemed to get anything right in Janet's eyes. To make matters worse, Jerry never intervened or stood up for her. He simply stayed silent, letting Janet play her games with him as an accomplice. The doorbell rang, and Mary's stomach twisted into a knot. She knew who it was without even looking. It was Janet. Janet was always punctual, arriving exactly when she said she would. Mary took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the door, forcing a smile. She opened it to find Janet standing there, looking a little flustered. Her sharp eyes immediately scanned the hallway behind Mary, as if looking for something out of place. Janet said, her voice dripping with disdain, "You look tired." Mary's smile faltered for a moment before she managed to regain it. "Good evening, Janet. Please come in." Janet brushed past her, her gaze already moving around the house, searching for anything she could comment on. Mary shut the door and turned. She turned to see Janet approaching Jerry. He sat up, grinning, and greeted his mother with far more enthusiasm than he ever showed Mary. "Hey Ma, how was your trip?" Jerry asked, patting the spot next to him on the couch. Janet sat down, her eyes flicking towards Mary, who was still standing in the doorway, feeling like it was like she was an intruder in her own home. "It's fine," Janet said. "But Jerry, you need to take better care of yourself. You look thin. Are you eating enough?" She walked back into the kitchen, her heart pounding as she stirred the pot of soup on the stove, trying to keep her focus. The evening dragged on with Janet making snide comments about everything from the cleanliness of the house to the meal Mary had prepared. Mary tried to smile through it all, but each word cut deep. Her patience was tested, especially when Jerry laughed along, not once coming to her defense. The final straw came when Janet made a comment about their children, saying they would turn out to be unruly because of Mary's lax parenting. Mary's hands tightened around the edge of the table as she glanced at Jerry, hoping and praying he would say something. He would say something, anything to stand up for her, but he didn't. He just stared at his plate, pretending he hadn't heard. That night, as Mary lay in bed next to Jerry, she could feel the anger simmering beneath her skin. She had spent years putting up with Janet's cruelty, thinking that if she were patient enough she'd hoped things would change. But they hadn't. It was a realization that Jerry would never take her side, that he'd always choose his mother over her. She blinked back tears, staring at the ceiling, feeling unhappy. The following morning, Mary woke up early. She'd made up her mind. She couldn't keep living like this, not for herself and not for her children. She had to do something, had to take back some control over her life. She got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Jerry, and went to the kitchen. She started making breakfast, her movements deliberate and focused. Today was going to be different. When Janet came down the stairs, her eyes immediately landed on Mary, who was standing at the stove. Janet pursed her lips, already preparing to make some comment, but Mary turned to face her, her eyes meeting Janet with a calmness she hadn't felt in years. "Janet," Mary said, her voice steady. "We need to talk." Janet raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by what Mary had to say. She took a deep breath and said, "About the way you've been treating me, I can't keep doing this. I love Jerry, and I want to make this family work, but I won't allow you to disrespect me in my own home any longer." Janet's eyes widened in shock for a moment, and then Janet was speechless for a moment, then she laughed, a cold, mocking sound. "You think you can tell me what to do in my son's house?" Mary straightened her back, her hands steady as she set the spatula down. This is my home too, Janet. If you can't respect me, then you're not welcome here." Mary was about to say something when Jerry walked into the kitchen, looking between the two women with confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy from sleep. Mary looked at him, her heart pounding. "JJ, I need you to understand something. I love you, but I can't keep letting your mother treat me like this. If you can't stand up for me, I will stand up for myself." Jerry stared at her, his eyes wide. He looked at his mother, who was glaring at Mary with fury in her eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mary felt a pang of sadness as she realized in that moment that Jerry he'd never stand up for her. She turned back to the stove, her hand trembling slightly as she continued making breakfast. Janet stormed out of the kitchen, and Jerry just stood there looking lost. Mary didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She'd said what she needed to say, and now it was time to move on. It was up to Jerry to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. Janet had locked herself in the guest room, and Jerry spent most of his time avoiding Mary. His eyes were filled with confusion and anger whenever they crossed paths. Mary felt a strange sense of calm for the first time in years. It had been ages since she'd stood up for herself. She wasn't sure what would happen, but she knew she'd done the right thing that night. As Mary sat on the edge of her bed, she heard a soft knock on the door. She looked up to see her daughter standing there, her eyes wide with worry. Mary smiled gently, patting the young girl climbed up onto the bed and sat next to her mother, resting her head on Mary's shoulder. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Mary replied, wrapping her arm around her daughter and holding her close. "Sometimes we have to do hard things to make things better, but I promise you, everything will be okay. I promise you everything will be okay," her daughter said, nodding and closing her eyes as she snuggled closer. Mary kissed the top of her head, feeling her heart swell with determination. She had done this for her children and for herself. No matter what happened next, she knew she would find a way to make it through, because she was stronger than she had ever. The next morning, Janet packed her things and left without saying anything. Jerry watched her go, but didn't say anything to Mary. She didn't push him, knowing he needed time to process everything and decide where his loyalties lay. She knew he'd come to his own decision in time. Days passed, and things began to change. Jerry was initially distant, but Mary remained patient. She focused on her children and making their home a place filled with love and respect. She refused to let the past control her anymore. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jerry finally spoke. At last he spoke. His voice was hesitant and unsure. "Mary, I've been thinking about what you said about my mum and everything. I want to do better for you, for us." Mary looked at him. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the struggle he was going through. She nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "Thank you, Jerry." Softly, "That's all I've ever wanted, for us to be a team." Jerry reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I love you, Mary. I know I've let you down and I'm sorry. I want to make it right." Tears filled Mary's eyes and she smiled, squeezing his hand. "I love you too, Jerry, and I believe we can make it work." It had been a long time since Mary had felt this optimistic about the future. She knew it wouldn't be plain sailing, that there would be challenges along the way, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. She wasn't alone, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Jerry began to change. He started standing up for Mary and defending her when Janet called with her usual criticisms. He made an effort to be more present and more supportive. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but Mary could see that he was trying, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, as the sun set, Jerry turned to Mary. His eyes were filled with emotion. He said, "I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I want you to know that I'm committed to being better and being the husband you deserve." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with love. She reached out and took his hand in hers. "I know, Jerry," she said. "I'm proud of you. For fighting for our family." Jerry nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He leaned over, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Mary. I promise I'll never let anyone make you feel less than you are ever again." Mary closed her eyes, leaning into his embrace for the first time in a long time. She felt truly at peace. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be without challenges, but she was ready for them. It might have its ups and downs, but she also knew that together They could face anything because they were a team, and nothing could break them apart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their home, Mary knew that this was just the start of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a better tomorrow. She couldn't wait to see where their journey would take them.